I don't think it's red. All right, we look pretty good now. So I'm going to be talking about component libraries, and you might say, what's a component library? Which is what everyone at my company said when I said, hey, let's build a component library. So I tried to make it easier for them. Everyone had heard of Bootstrap, and so at work I started working on something called Bootstripe. It's pretty good. You'll get it. It'll come to you. So I encourage you to build your own component library, mainly so you get to make your own something strap, JSConf.ar, whatever you want to do. Stripe strap didn't work quite as well as Bootstripe, so that's what we went with. But why write one at all? You could just build your application, and then when you get to a button, you style the button, and then when you get to a drop-down, you style the drop-down, just like we've made web applications for a really long time. So I've prepared a list of facts that are definitely true about CSS. The first CSS fact is that once you write a line of CSS, it can never be deleted. It sounds like a myth, but if you think about your app, you're always just a little too scared to remove code. And so you just add new classes to go over those ones. So I like to call CSS an append-only language. That's good. You get code like this. This is my favorite. I always see blocks like this. You put this on a div, it literally does nothing. But you're like, well, is it overriding the padding? I'm just going to leave this here. This is fine, I think. It's not hurting anyone, so never remove it. Yeah. So fact 2 is preprocessors are great as long as you know exactly what the output. This is my favorite way of looking at nesting. Very common output. For you gzip lovers, this is like your best case scenario, though, so that's pretty great. CSS fact 3 is that no two people write CSS in a similar way. I feel like I work with some of the smartest people in the universe, and this is probably about as best as I could ask for. Literally every type of casing, and then some casings that don't actually exist. So yeah, I'm sure you recognize the naming schemes from your own code, and that's why you're laughing. So CSS fact 4 is you cannot test CSS. It doesn't run in a way that you can get stuff out. There's not really a good joke for this one, so I'll move to CSS 5. So you can't upgrade to a new version of Bootstrap without an animal sacrifice. And I decided not to include an image for that one. So deleting code and testing actually go hand in hand. The easiest way to feel comfortable deleting something is to make sure that you have tests to make sure it doesn't break something whenever you delete it. So component libraries are well-tested and highly reusable libraries for UI components. They would be ridiculous to test if you did them inside of your application. So in a component library, you're often testing that when you hover and it's active and the keyboard focuses on and you're looking sideways, that the thing comes around the edges of the button correctly. And if you did that inside of your application every time you had a button, that would be ridiculous. But luckily, with a component library, you can kind of focus on those nice, detailed things. And so the reason why this is important is because this is me on a good day. It's probably my best outfit. I look really sharp. I had a recent haircut. I'm next to something involving art. It looks like everything even matches. My clothes are on the right direction. It's a pretty good day for me. The code that I read on this day is going to be well-intentioned. I'm clear thinking, and I'm going to do things for the right reason. This is me on a normal day. This is about 90% of the time, 99% of the time maybe. And component libraries are all about making sure that this version of yourself doesn't ruin the app for everybody. So use your best days to build up components that you can use mindlessly on your worst days. So you can do things like keyboard accessibility. Oh, I put in a fancy thing. Oh, responsiveness. There you go. Oh, I don't know actually how Keynote transitions work, so forgive me. That was sweet. Focus states. It's the only way focus states can be interesting is if they sparkle. So active, hover, focus, like I talked about before, and that's real. We really have styles that if you have been using your keyboard and you're pressing down and your mouse happens to be over something, like you can't have some weird state. That's a real state, and you've never considered it before, I hope. But I hope you do in the future because of this stuff. So it turns this very crappy but well-intentioned Mario clay, you know, it's fully sculpted. Like there was no instruction manual. There's nothing anyone can do to help you make your perfect, fairly flawed Mario. And it turns that into this, which is, you know, you have building blocks, you have pieces, and you have instructions on how to put it all together. And so we do the same thing for Bootstripe. We have this documentation that looks beautiful on this screen. And we have what something is, we have how to use it, we have examples of it being used. And that really helps create consistency for developers on how they integrate things, but also helps create consistency for your end users. Every time that they encounter a button, every time they encounter a nav menu, they're going to know it's going to work the same way each time. Bonus, everyone has like the admin toolbar backend thing, and it's really great that now whenever we build these stupid, crappy internal applications, you can just use your thing and it kind of looks like you tried. That's just bonus. So how can you make a component library? Or more specifically, how can I make a component library and it's going to be any better than just using Bootstrap out of the box? And that's a good question. You probably could use Bootstrap for a lot of stuff, but Bootstrap's core competency is genericness. It wants to be the baseline. It has no styles on buttons, and it's fairly accessible, but everything looks the same, and people are pretty tired of Bootstrap websites by now. If you get in on Bootstrap 4 early enough, maybe that'll be cool for like a month or two. So first thing you want to do is choose a preprocessor. Not strictly necessary, but really helps if you're parsing CSS. You can do a lot of the testing things that we're going to talk about. At Stripe, we didn't choose a very normal one. We wrote our own called KFCSS. You guys have KFC here? Either way. So KFCSS is actually just a set of modules on top of rework CSS. So mostly we're using open source plugins to do a lot of the things that you like. It'd be similar to like Myth if people use Myth. It tries to model CSS4 as closely as possible. So this would be really good for Seb's talk, where you're kind of more polyfilling the future than you are kind of creating your own magic. We also kill things like extend so we don't get crazy nesting, and we just deal with writing a class name twice. Suit CSS is a good starting point. We don't use Suit out of the box, but we kind of forked it and made it work for our needs. This is from Nicholas out of Twitter, and this is really good for creating encapsulated CSS components, so you can reason about your code in nice little cool blocks that you know exactly what they're doing. So here's the example on the naming conventions, which is mostly what CSS is a set of naming conventions. And you can say this is a component, and people, like, their eyes bleed whenever there's a capital class name, but you get used to it, I promise. It's kind of like when everyone tells you JSX is so ugly, and then they use it, and they're like, oh, JSX is actually pretty cool. This is great because you can always tell what is a component in your classes and what isn't. And then you have structured ways of saying this is a modification, or this is a descendant, or this is something else. And so you can kind of get rid of this whole problem that we had earlier. You can add in your own checks to your system, and I'd encourage you to add in checks into, like, you can write rework plugins, more or less, if you choose rework, in order to jump into your CSS and pick out things that are important to your organization. One thing that bugged me at work is color checking. So I wrote CSS color guard, if you've seen that. And CSS color guard is actually fairly useless, but I thought it was a cool idea, and we use it kind of at CI, continuous integration testing time. But to show a good example, here's Guillermo's post today from on Facebook about the road towards yesterday, road towards JavaScript. And let's say you wanted to know the color of those 3 buttons. You could use DevTools, but all of us have gone through the real way that we would do this, which is to zoom into 1,000,000%. I drop the darkest middle point of the E, and then it works every time. That's definitely going to be the correct hex code. So luckily, there is an algorithm that people in the television industry created called CIEDE 2000. Sounds like a robot, which is also cool. They wrote this hella mathy formula for figuring out the differences of colors to humans. So something with a low score would be very similar. A 0 would be the same color. And so like yellows are kind of harder to discern the differences between than something like blue. And so it's not actually just like compared to hex values. And so you can get this really fine-grained way of saying how similar are these 2 colors. And then you can yell at your coworkers automatically and say like, hey, this blue is clearly should be Facebook blue, and you're like 2 hex characters off. How about you just switch it to our style guide color? Also, you're fired. We have a lot of APIs at Stripe. We have an API for firing people, so it's very simple. The best part about writing CSS color guard, let's go back to that page. I'm going to run through all these again. The CIED 2000 algorithm, this super mathy one, that was an NPM module. So I got all the credit, and someone else had to do all the math. Pro tip. So here's an example of one of our test pages. So you can test CSS as long as you're testing something very small, well-defined, and relatively declaratively. So this is 2 ways of marking up a switcher or a toggle. So you could kind of toggle between those 3 things. And we have a disabled state because there's that. And we have an active state. We're using the isActive and isDisabled, which is from the Suit CSS naming scheme. And you can kind of see the 3 different ways that those look. We're not clicking on anything. We're not doing anything. But we can run that through our CI server. We can take a screenshot of it, and we can make sure that it doesn't change unless we wanted it to change. So if you accidentally change the base blue color, you accidentally change the margin around buttons in some other file, this file will throw an error. We can go into that a little bit. So I rework pseudo classes. This is another example of why we chose to do KFCSS as small modules on top of kind of your preprocessor. All this does is take things like the pseudo hover class and turn them into literally the word .pseudo-hover. So something like this, some selector :active turns into the real selector as well as the declarative selector. And then you can actually add some things to your declarative test pages. So you can have your button, and then you can actually add all your pseudo states. And that way you don't have to use a mouse to go in and then drag over it and then try to take a screenshot exactly as you click down with the fake mouse and then pull out. And it's never good, especially when you're dealing with Sauce Labs or something that you don't even have control over. So that's never good. So you can do all this, and then you actually get a much bigger page with all the different states. And like I said before, there is the isActive focus hovered state there, and it looks different than the other states, and it's correct and good. So we run this test every time we make a commit. And if anything changes, say the margin around the buttons, we get this diff that says, hey, did you mean to do this? And that'll actually fail the build. If we want, we can commit a new image and say, we intended to do this. And then you can actually see the change that happens. And this seems like a cool video that I put together. But this is actually just the onion skin swiper from GitHub. So now we have a rule that in order to make a change in Bootstripe, a designer must sign off on any image changes. So now every time anything visually changes in our entire library, it either fails a build because it wasn't supposed to happen, or a designer says, this looks correct and it's OK. So abstraction is key to some of the other problems that we have. Deleting code is too hard was one of them, and changing component means that you have to go find every single use in every app that you ever use it in. You may remember trying to upgrade from Bootstrap 2 to 3. People try to write whole scanners of your app to go change the classes in markup and all that kind of stuff, and that really stinks. So one of the reasons we can't delete code is because we don't know who's using the past versions and who's using the new versions. And so we can kind of pull out the writing of the markup and the inclusion of the classes into its own abstracted library. So a lot of people are saying, this is JSConf, you're talking about CSS an awful lot, so this part's for you. So you can turn all your CSS components into JS application components. So you can pick your favorite poison. They all have versions of components that you can use. We actually have libraries for React and Ember at Stripe. There is a few Angular apps internally that I'm sure will eventually get Bootstripe Angular versions. So never use your component library directly, which seems kind of counterintuitive. You never do this. Never write a button with markup with the classes that you use. Notice we actually do have a Bootstripe prefix on all of those things. That way you could actually technically use multiple versions or anything like that you wanted. And it's helpfully BS is our prefix, and I really enjoy writing that each time. So the BS button and is being modified as a BS button large, but we don't want to write that. We created initially Ember Bootstripe, and we created components, just Ember components. And this is a BS button, and it has a size property. And internally, that modifies the class names on a real button tag. But now there's a single location that writes markup and adds these classes. So if we realize that screen readers don't like the way that we've marked up our button in 2 months, we can go to a single location, change the way it's marked up, and it's done. This actually happened with buttons. Did you know with the button class, that compiles to this. But this actually is a submit button. I didn't know that the default type of button was submit. It's not button. Type button is what you actually have to add to this. So later we went in and added button type equals button, and it no longer accidentally submitted everything on every page. Just great. Good side effect. So it also can automatically generate your style guide for you. So a lot of people talk about a living style guide, and the common outcome is that you write it once, and then it's never updated, and then no one ever visits it again, and it was a waste of 2 months. And so you can actually use your components in order to generate both the markup and the examples. You just integrate your components, and anytime you update your application, your style guide automatically updates. And so now you at least have some semblance of a living dead style guide that still no one visits anyways, but at least you know that it's correct. If you want to see more information about good style guides, the Lonely Planet team has this great resource, which is their style guide. It's called Rizzo, and I think it's fantastic. They have all these different examples. You should check out Rizzo by the Lonely Planet, who would have expected. So deleting code becomes a lot easier because we have these small encapsulated files with good naming schemes, and we have good tests. And so you can come in here and you can definitely say that if I want to change the hover color or delete the hover color, you know exactly where to go in the file. You know that you can delete it, and then you can run the tests and know that only the change that I wanted to make was made. You can also upgrade because now you're never writing the raw HTML, you're only writing your components, and those are encapsulated. You can make the changes you want, and everything gets upgraded everywhere. You can throw in a grid. We use Flexbox Grid because Flexbox is cool. And all of a sudden, you can make about 90% of your application just by piecing together your highly tested, well-crafted, what's good? I had a joke, I couldn't think of it. Your well-crafted CSS components all together on a page, and then you can focus on that last little sliver that makes your application great and good. You're never going to be able to just put together an application that just immediately works and looks great just because of your component library, but you can really, really focus on the things that makes each page different or each interaction different. And that's all. Thank you. Oh, this is a snapshot that I screenshotted from Guillermo.